Welcome to Bio Bytes, where we bring history's most compelling, shocking, and sometimes terrifying stories to life. Here, we dive deep into the lives of individuals whose choices, actions, and beliefs have impacted the world in profound ways, whether for good or for unspeakable evil. Our journey is not just one of names and dates. It's about understanding the forces that shape people, the environments that push them, and the influences that turn ordinary lives into infamous legends. Today's story takes us into the darkest reaches of World War II, through the gates of concentration camps, and into the life of a figure who has become synonymous with brutality. This is a story not for the faint-hearted, as it forces us to look squarely at the darkest corners of the human psyche, at the conditions and ideologies that turn people into monsters. We're here to explore a life that came to represent some of the most chilling extremes of human behavior, a name etched in infamy. This is the story of Irma Grese, a woman whose path from a small village in Germany led her to become one of the most feared figures of the Holocaust. So let us begin, as we peel back the layers of history and the choices that led to one of the most haunting legacies of the 20th century. Irma Grese, a name that echoes through the annals of history, a name that survivors of the Holocaust remember with fear, and a name that stands as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. She was one of the youngest and most feared female guards in the Nazi concentration camps, remembered not just for her brutal actions, but also for her unique combination of beauty and sadism that earned her the nickname, the Beautiful Beast. For those who suffered under her hand, Grese was a figure of terror, a woman who wielded power with an unsettling pleasure, leaving behind stories of violence and malice that almost defy belief. She became infamous, a symbol of what happens when ideology, power, and cruelty merge. But who was Irma Grese before she became the hyena of Auschwitz? What events, beliefs, and influences transformed an ordinary rural girl from northern Germany into one of history's most notorious figures? This question, though complex and haunting, is central to our exploration today. Was Irma Grese's cruelty born from her personal circumstances, her family background, or the unforgiving ideology of the Nazi regime? Could it have been different if she had lived in another time, another place, or under different influences? Understanding Irma's story is not about finding excuses, but about uncovering the layers that create the conditions for such profound inhumanity. Her life and choices challenge our understanding of human nature, forcing us to confront the question, how can an individual become capable of such cruelty? And equally important, what lessons does her life teach us about the systems, ideologies, and environments that enable individuals to descend into darkness? In our attempt to answer these questions, we will journey through each stage of her life, from her early days in a seemingly innocent German village to her brutal rise within the ranks of the SS, from her encounters with Nazi ideology in her youth to her ultimate fate after the war's end. Irma Grese's life, once marked by quiet beginnings, became a chilling symbol of the terror inflicted on millions. As we embark on this exploration, remember that this story is not merely about the individual, it is also about the machinery of hate that enabled her actions. It is about the systems that allowed her to embrace a life of cruelty, and the ideologies that convinced her she was justified in doing so. So, what transformed Irma Grese from a rural girl to a figure of historical infamy? Today, as we follow her journey, we hope to uncover not just the personal motivations, but also the societal forces and the harsh ideologies that turned her life into one of history's darkest tales. Irma Ilse Ida Grese was born on October 7, 1923, in the small, picturesque village of Rieschen, situated in Germany's northern Mecklenburg region. Rieschen was a place that felt untouched by the grand upheavals of the world. It was a quiet, almost secluded community of modest farmers, dairy workers, and laborers who moved through life with the rhythm of the seasons. This rural, pastoral backdrop is where Irma spent her early years. Irma's family was a part of the working class, neither wealthy nor particularly impoverished. Her father, Alfred Grese, held a position of responsibility as the overseer of a local estate's dairy. This job, though not highly paid, offered the Grese family a stable life, with enough resources to ensure they were slightly better off than some of their neighbors. Her mother, Berta, managed the home, tending to domestic chores, a small vegetable garden, and a few farm animals that supplemented the family's diet. This household, a father who worked with discipline and a mother who managed a modest home, seemed ordinary from the outside. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Alfred was known to be strict, a man whose discipline bordered on authoritarian. Some neighbors described him as merely firm, but others suspected he could be harsh, even heavy-handed in his treatment of his children. Life under his roof meant obedience, silence, and respect for authority. There were times, some neighbors would later recall, when Alfred's drinking was concerning. While there were debates over whether he was a problematic drinker, his harsh discipline left a mark on his children, creating an atmosphere that was often rigid and emotionally strained. Irma was the third of 5 siblings, nestled between 2 older and 2 younger siblings, her brother Alfred, her sister Lieschen, and her younger siblings, Helene and Otto. Childhood was punctuated by sibling rivalry, shared chores, and the normal rhythms of rural family life. However, her family's stability would soon be shattered by a tragedy that would cast a dark shadow over the young Irma's life and reshape the way she saw her family and the world. In December 1935, when Irma was just 12, her mother, Berta, learned that Alfred had been having an affair with the daughter of a local pub owner. This discovery devastated Berta, who had dedicated her life to her family and home. Betrayed and humiliated, she took drastic action. She set about cleaning the family home, enlisting her children to help her scrub every corner, as if creating order in her physical world might cleanse the betrayal in her heart. When the house was spotless, she sent the children to fetch their father from the pub. While they were gone, Berta drank hydrochloric acid, a commonly used cleaning solution in those days, in a desperate attempt to take her own life. Though her children and husband found her and rushed her to the hospital, the damage was done. For several painful weeks, Berta lingered in the hospital, and her children, including Irma, were forced to witness the slow deterioration of the woman who had been their mother, the bedrock of their family. In January 1936, Berta succumbed to her injuries, leaving Irma and her siblings to pick up the pieces of a shattered family life. The impact of this tragedy was profound. Irma, a sensitive and introverted child by nature, became even more withdrawn after her mother's death. Once shy but dutiful, she now distanced herself from her siblings, often preferring to sit alone on a hillside, watching the clouds pass by or listening to the quiet sounds of the countryside. Her world had changed, and the emotional wounds left by her mother's death festered in the silence of her isolation. Neighbors and acquaintances would later recall that Irma became more detached from those around her, often appearing lost in thought or completely removed from her surroundings. Where other children played and formed friendships, Irma kept to herself, haunted by memories and unanswered questions. In 1933, around the same time her mother's death cast a shadow over her family, Adolf Hitler rose to power, and the Nazi Party began reshaping every aspect of German society, from politics to the daily lives of its citizens. The education system, too, underwent a radical transformation, with the Nazi ideology being incorporated into the curriculum at every level. Children were taught the values of National Socialism, including racial purity, and the dangers of so-called undesirable elements within society. Even in remote, rural villages like Recken, this ideology permeated schools and seeped into the minds of young Germans. For children like Irma, this curriculum was both a learning experience and an indoctrination, shaping her understanding of German identity, loyalty, and duty. For girls, the Nazi regime promoted the League of German Girls, the female wing of the Hitler Youth, which encouraged young women to embrace traditional gender roles, prepare for motherhood, and devote themselves to the ideals of the Reich. At her school, Irma was introduced to the League, and as she grew older, she expressed a desire to join. For her, the League represented a chance to belong, to escape the isolation that had crept into her life after her mother's death. It was a place where she could find identity, pride, and purpose, a chance to be part of something greater than herself. But her father, Alfred, was reluctant. Although he joined the Nazi Party in 1937, Alfred initially refused to let Irma join the League of German Girls. His reasoning is unclear. Perhaps he felt that the local chapter was too far, the journey too dangerous for his daughter, or perhaps he had reservations about the Nazi Party despite his membership. This restriction only deepened the tension between Irma and her father, reinforcing her resentment toward him. Irma, who felt trapped under his control, saw her father's refusal as another barrier, another way he kept her from finding herself. For Irma, the League of German Girls symbolized an escape, a way to explore her individuality outside the confines of her father's strict rule. It promised camaraderie, a sense of belonging, and most enticing of all, a sense of importance. Nazi ideology placed great value on rural Germans, promoting them as the backbone of the nation, the source of pure Aryan strength and virtue. This rhetoric resonated deeply with Irma, who began to see her rural roots not as limitations but as a badge of honor, a way to be part of the Reich's vision of a powerful and united Germany. By the time she was 14, the tensions between Irma and her father had become palpable. Alfred's reluctance to let her join the League of German Girls was only one aspect of their growing conflict. He remarried in 1939, bringing a new wife and 4 stepchildren into the Grese household, creating a blended family that only deepened Irma's feelings of isolation and resentment. For her, this new family was a reminder of everything she had lost, and it further strained her already difficult relationship with her father. She yearned for independence, for an escape from her family's haunted past and her father's control. In 1938, Irma dropped out of school and joined a government-administered youth labor program. She went to work in a dairy factory in Fürstenberg, a job that allowed her to move beyond her father's household and gave her a sense of purpose, however small. After 6 months at the factory, she worked in a shop in Lychen, gaining skills and experiencing a semblance of independence for the first time in her life. Though she wasn't yet free of her family, she was on her own, finding ways to cope with the emotional scars of her mother's death and her strained relationship with her father. However, this path didn't satisfy Irma's ambitions. Her dream was to become a nurse, to find a respectable, honorable position that would give her a purpose and respect in a society that valued discipline and service. But despite her best efforts, her lack of education and limited social connections restricted her options. She returned briefly to her family in Fürstenberg, only to find herself feeling even more isolated. Alfred's marriage brought not only step-siblings but eventually a half-sibling into Irma's life, crowding the once quiet home she had known. In 1939, she finally left her family for good, her dreams of nursing still in her heart but her prospects limited. She was a young woman, searching for purpose, struggling with her own traumas and frustrations, and yearning for something to validate her existence. With limited education, few connections, and a world at war, Irma's ambitions soon collided with a regime that offered her both purpose and authority, introducing her to a path that would turn her life toward unimaginable darkness. Her journey from a disillusioned, frustrated girl to a feared SS guard had begun, marked by tragedy, loss, and the subtle but persistent influence of a regime that valued power, obedience, and an unyielding loyalty to its ideology. Irma Grese's early ambitions hinted at a desire to make something of herself, to transcend her modest background and carve out an identity that was her own. Despite her family's limited means and her father's constraints, Irma harbored aspirations that reached far beyond the boundaries of rural life in Recken. Her dream was to become a nurse, a profession she saw as noble, dignified, and perhaps a way to find respect and independence in a world that had given her few choices. In her mind, nursing was a calling, a chance to heal and serve, far removed from the routine of dairy farms and family squabbles. But this dream, like so many in Irma's life, would take an unforeseen, darker turn. In 1938, at just 15 years old, Irma left school to join Germany's youth labor program. She cycled through menial jobs, working first at a dairy factory in Fürstenberg and later at a small shop in Lychen. These roles, though steady, provided little fulfillment and fell far short of the life Irma had envisioned. They offered no escape, no sense of the importance or self-worth she longed for. After a year of these unremarkable jobs, her determination to escape this unfulfilling path deepened. By 1941, she set her sights on an apprenticeship at the Hohenlychen sanatorium, a clinic that had gained notoriety as a center of Nazi research and experimental medicine. Hohenlychen had once been a tuberculosis treatment facility, but under the Nazi regime, it had transformed into a research center focusing on experimental treatments and rehabilitation for injured SS officers. At first glance, it seemed an ideal place for Irma to begin her nursing career. She entered with high hopes, envisioning herself as part of a community dedicated to care and medical advancement. But the Hohenlychen Sanatorium was anything but a place of healing. The clinic, led by Dr. Karl Gebhardt, was a shadow domain where medicine met cruelty, and where scientific inquiry was overshadowed by barbaric experimentation. Dr. Gebhardt, a loyal Nazi physician, had gained a reputation for his willingness to push medical ethics beyond their limits, particularly on prisoners deemed expendable by the regime. Jewish women were transferred to Hohenlychen from nearby Ravensbrück concentration camp, brought in not as patients, but as subjects of gruesome experimentation. Dr. Gebhardt and his team inflicted painful procedures on these prisoners, testing sulfa drugs on wounds deliberately infected, performing bone grafts, and conducting nerve repair surgeries without anesthesia. Irma, as a nurse's apprentice, wasn't directly involved in these procedures, but she was close enough to witness the horrors. Her duties were menial. She sterilized instruments, cleaned the operating rooms, and prepared patients for surgery. But from her position she saw the suffering, the agony etched onto the faces of the women treated like lab specimens. This exposure to Nazi medicine marked a pivotal shift in Irma's view of human life. Under the guise of clinical necessity, the inhumane became routine. What should have been a profound violation of the principles of care became, to Irma, a twisted norm. The lines between healing and harm, between treatment and torture, blurred until they barely existed. At Hohenlychen, she witnessed cruelty framed as scientific progress, as if the agony inflicted on others was a necessary sacrifice for the advancement of knowledge. This normalization of cruelty became part of her frame of reference, desensitizing her to the human suffering she had once considered tragic. As the months passed, Irma's early aspirations seemed to dissolve. The hope she had invested in becoming a nurse faded under the grim reality of Hohenlychen's practices. Despite her exposure to this dark side of Nazi medicine, or perhaps because of it, Irma found herself increasingly fascinated by the authority and control that individuals like Dr. Gebhardt wielded. Her desire to help and heal shifted into a darker ambition, an attraction to the power held by those in authority, those who determined life and death. In 1943, after 2 years at Hohenlychen, Irma was dismissed. Dr. Gebhardt informed her that she lacked the competence needed to continue her training, a final blow to the dreams she had once held dear. For Irma, the dismissal was devastating, a public rejection of her worth and abilities. She returned to Fürstenberg, humiliated and angry, her sense of failure compounded by the emotional scars of her time at Hohenlychen. The ambitions that had once given her life meaning now felt distant, replaced by bitterness and resentment. Her future, once filled with visions of nursing, seemed bleak and empty. But Dr. Gebhardt offered a lifeline, though it would ultimately steer her down a much darker path. He suggested that she apply for a position as a prison guard, even offering a referral to an acquaintance within the camp administration. The idea of working as a guard was far removed from her nursing dreams, but it offered her something Hohenlychen had not: a new purpose, a chance to redeem herself in the eyes of her superiors, and the power and authority that she had come to crave. Irma was initially too young for the position, as SS regulations required guards to be at least 18, but the idea of working in a camp had taken root, and over the next year, she continued her menial work at the Fürstenberg dairy factory, biding her time and nursing a growing resentment toward a world that had seemingly denied her ambitions. By the time she turned 18 in 1942, she was ready to join the SS. Her application was quickly accepted, and she was assigned to begin training at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück was Germany's largest camp for women, a place where Nazi ideology was enforced with brutal efficiency. It was a stark world where prisoners, mostly women from occupied territories, were forced into grueling labor, under horrific conditions. Ravensbrück had earned its reputation as a place of relentless suffering, where medical experimentation, starvation, and brutality were daily realities. Irma's decision to join the SS marked a turning point, the beginning of her immersion into the machinery of the Nazi regime. The ambitions of her youth, the dream of nursing, the desire to serve, had warped into something unrecognizable. Her exposure to cruelty at Hohenlychen had reshaped her understanding of power, and the SS offered her the very authority and influence that her brief career in nursing had denied her. As she left her family and rural life behind, Irma Grese stepped into a new world, one that rewarded obedience, loyalty, and a willingness to inflict suffering on others. She was no longer the uncertain young woman from a fractured family. In Ravensbrück, Irma would begin her final transformation, molded by the brutal principles of Nazi discipline into an enforcer of terror, a figure whose name would soon become synonymous with fear and cruelty. With the trajectory of her life now firmly set, Irma Grese entered the SS, abandoning any trace of her past hopes and dreams. She was no longer just a woman seeking purpose. She was a recruit in a system that demanded absolute obedience and a hardened soul, a system that would nurture her worst tendencies and shape her into a tool of atrocity. When Irma Grese arrived at Ravensbrück concentration camp for her SS training, she entered a world where compassion was a liability and cruelty a skill. The camp itself was notorious. Its brutal conditions, unspeakable medical experiments, and the suffering of its prisoners had given it a dark reputation even among the network of Nazi camps. Ravensbrück was not only a holding center for prisoners, but also a training ground, designed to prepare new recruits to enforce SS rules with the hardened indifference required to oversee such places. Irma had left behind any pretense of nursing or care. She was now stepping into a role that demanded an entirely different kind of skill set. The training at Ravensbrück was structured with a single goal: to erase any trace of empathy or hesitation. Recruits were instructed to see prisoners not as human beings, but as enemies of the Reich, enemies who deserved no sympathy, no compassion, and certainly no kindness. Every task, every lesson reinforced this mentality, chipping away at the recruits' individual moral compasses until all that remained was the cold logic of Nazi obedience. For Irma, who had already witnessed the horrors of Nazi experimentation at Hohenlychen, the transition to this new mindset was easier than it might have been for others. From the first day of training, new recruits were drilled in the importance of toughness and hardness. These values were not only preached but brutally enforced. Senior officers emphasized that weakness was unacceptable, that tenderness was a flaw to be eradicated. To be an effective SS guard was to embody these qualities fully, to demonstrate a resolve that would never falter in the face of the prisoner's suffering. The concept of duty, as taught by the SS, was intertwined with a readiness to inflict pain, to punish, to enforce, to control without hesitation. One of the central figures in Irma's training was Senior Matron Dorothea Binz, a name feared by prisoners and respected by the other guards. Binz was infamous for her sadism, a woman whose cruelty was almost legendary within Ravensbrück. She carried herself with an air of authority, wielding her whip and pistol with an almost theatrical flourish. For new recruits like Irma, Dorothea Binz was both a teacher and a model, a demonstration of what a guard should aspire to be. She seemed to take pleasure in her authority, showing no hesitation in beating prisoners or issuing punishments on a whim. Her reputation had been built on a history of brutal actions, and she reinforced in her trainees the idea that such ruthlessness was not only acceptable, but necessary. Irma observed Binz closely, noting her methods, her attitude, and her interactions with prisoners. Binz's unflinching cruelty became a point of reference, a template that Irma would soon follow. As Irma absorbed these lessons, she began to understand that cruelty was not simply a byproduct of her duty. It was a tool, a way to exert control and establish her dominance over those deemed lesser. Binz's influence was not formal or overt, but for someone like Irma, who had already begun to crave authority, It provided a model of what an SS guard could become. Over the course of her training, Irma witnessed punishments carried out with brutal efficiency. Recruits watched as prisoners were beaten, starved, humiliated, and sometimes even killed for infractions as minor as speaking out of turn or failing to complete a task. Guards in training were encouraged to watch closely, to absorb the methods, and to learn to respond without emotion. Training exercises were conducted to reinforce this attitude, often pitting recruits against prisoners in scenarios designed to test their resolve. Recruits were made to participate in the punishments, administering beatings or shouting orders at frightened prisoners. Those who hesitated were met with harsh reprimands, made to feel their hesitation was a weakness that had no place in the SS. Psychologists who have studied the training methods at Ravensbrück describe this process as a form of psychological conditioning, one that actively suppressed empathy and reinforced aggressive tendencies. By witnessing, participating in, and eventually leading these acts of violence, recruits were desensitized, numb to the moral implications of their actions. For many guards, the initial shock and horror of their duties faded within weeks, replaced by a hardened exterior that accepted cruelty as routine. For Irma, this process was transformative. She had already been embittered by her failed nursing career and her personal disappointments, and the SS training gave her an outlet, a way to channel her frustrations and her longing for power into a role that demanded dominance. In a few short weeks, she went from observing acts of cruelty to committing them herself, pushing past any lingering sense of humanity she might have retained. The camp became her world, a place where violence was the norm and authority her ultimate goal. Part of Irma's transformation came from the isolation that the SS training fostered. Recruits were taught to see themselves as part of a powerful, elite group, a brotherhood and sisterhood of sorts, bound by loyalty to the Reich and to each other. But this loyalty had its own dark twist. Any sign of leniency toward prisoners, any show of mercy, was seen as a betrayal of the SS's values. Recruits were encouraged to monitor each other, reporting any behavior that seemed soft or insufficiently brutal. The SS culture was one of ruthless competition, where guards gained status by demonstrating their hardness, their willingness to push boundaries and inflict punishment without hesitation. Morning and evening roll calls became significant training exercises, reinforcing the expected behavior and conduct for all guards. These roll calls often lasted for hours, with prisoners forced to stand in lines no matter the weather, while guards like Irma learned to scrutinize, punish, and control them. Any minor infraction, or even a perceived one, was an opportunity for discipline, a slap, a shout, a beating. For recruits, these exercises were a means of learning to view prisoners as expendable, as bodies to be controlled, rather than as individuals with dignity. By the end of their training, many recruits had adopted the SS's view of prisoners as little more than enemies to be crushed underfoot. The psychological effects of this training, historians and psychologists note, were profound. Within weeks, individuals who might once have been ordinary young men and women were conditioned to accept and even revel in acts of cruelty. Irma Grese, once a girl with dreams of becoming a nurse, now found herself wielding power over prisoners, using the whip and the baton as instruments of control. She had become a tool of the Nazi state, molded by the ruthless training that stripped her of any remaining empathy and replaced it with a hunger for authority. By the time her training at Ravensbrück was complete, Irma was no longer the quiet, withdrawn girl from Recken. She had become hardened, desensitized, a figure ready to enforce the brutal rules of the concentration camps. She had absorbed the SS's lessons well, internalizing the belief that toughness equaled cruelty, that loyalty to the Reich meant ruthlessness, and that authority was best expressed through violence. Ravensbrück had done its work. Irma was now ready for her next post, a place where her newly acquired skills would be put to full use. As she prepared to leave Ravensbrück, she carried with her not only the tools of her training but a new identity, one that embodied the very essence of Nazi ideology. She was not just a guard, but a willing participant in a regime that demanded absolute obedience. and an unyielding commitment to the destruction of those deemed unworthy. Her transformation was complete, and her path was now set. The young woman who had once dreamed of healing others had now become an enforcer of death and terror. Irma Grese was ready for Auschwitz. In the summer of 1942, Irma Grese arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, one of the most notorious concentration camps in Nazi-occupied Poland. For most new arrivals, Auschwitz was a death sentence. For Irma, it was an opportunity. At 19, she was among the youngest of the guards, but her ruthless commitment to Nazi ideology and her hardened spirit soon caught the attention of her superiors. Within months, Irma had risen to the rank of senior matron in the women's camp, a position that brought with it both authority and power over the lives of tens of thousands of prisoners. Her transformation from a struggling girl in rural Germany to a feared enforcer of the Third Reich was complete. As senior matron, Irma wielded terrifying control. Survivor testimonies from Auschwitz describe her as a haunting figure who patrolled the camp with her signature weapons, a whip, a silver-plated pistol, and her German shepherd. Her appearance meticulously groomed with her SS uniform fitted to perfection, her blonde hair often in 2 braids, and her face marked with a cold detachment, only added to the dread she inspired among prisoners. She carried herself with pride, exuding a chilling authority as she moved through the barracks, always watching, always ready to punish any sign of weakness or resistance. Irma's role in Auschwitz brought her into close collaboration with some of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust, including Dr. Josef Mengele, known to the prisoners as the Angel of Death. Mengele's medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins, were notorious for their inhumanity, and Irma often assisted him during selections. These selection processes, held regularly, were chilling in their simplicity. Prisoners were lined up, assessed, and divided. One line meant forced labor, the other immediate death in the gas chambers. Irma's role was to help decide the fate of these prisoners, often with nothing more than a gesture, a point, or a nod. Her presence during these selections was terrifying for the prisoners. They watched, trembling, as she moved down the lines with a look of calm detachment. Witnesses recall that she would sometimes smile as she pointed prisoners toward death, a gesture that chilled those around her. She wore her authority as a badge of honor, an outward symbol of the loyalty and brutality she believed was expected of her. Over time, her behavior became a pattern, a ritual of terror that reinforced her nickname, the Hyena of Auschwitz. Irma's cruelty extended far beyond the selection lines. In her role as senior matron, she invented brutal games to inflict suffering and humiliation on the prisoners. One of her favored tactics was something the guards referred to as making sport, a phrase that concealed the sadistic nature of her actions. Making sport often involved creating arbitrary rules or tasks for prisoners, then punishing them when they inevitably failed. In one particularly infamous instance, Irma planted potato peels near the barracks entrance, knowing that hunger would drive some of the starving prisoners to try and retrieve them. She would lie in wait, hidden from view, until one of them dared to approach, and then she would pounce, beating the prisoner mercilessly with her whip for stealing food. Another of her cruel sports was carried out during roll calls, which could last for hours as prisoners stood in harsh weather, cold or heat, without moving. Irma would patrol the lines, scrutinizing each prisoner, and at the slightest movement or sign of fatigue, she would unleash her fury. For prisoners who tried to shield others, mothers protecting children, the elderly helping the weak, her punishments were particularly severe. Witnesses recall that she seemed to derive pleasure from inflicting pain, her face lighting up with satisfaction when she watched prisoners cower before her or beg for mercy. The routine beatings were only part of the terror Irma inspired. She also used her German shepherd as an instrument of intimidation and violence. Trained to respond to her commands, the dog was as feared as Irma herself, a physical extension of her cruelty. She would unleash the dog on prisoners without warning, often for minor or fabricated infractions. The dog's attacks were vicious, and survivors remember the screams of those who were mauled. many of whom were left with permanent injuries or died from the wounds. For Irma, the dog was both a symbol of her power and a weapon to enforce obedience. Prisoners recall that Irma's demeanor during these attacks was almost performative. She would strut through the camp, her polished boots and perfect uniform, a stark contrast to the emaciated, filthy bodies of the prisoners. Her uniform was her armor, her symbol of authority, and she wore it with pride. She demanded a level of cleanliness and order in the prisoners' quarters that was impossible for them to achieve under the camp's horrendous conditions, and she used this as another pretext for punishment. Any sign of dirt, a scuffed floor, or an unkempt bed would result in a beating or the withholding of food rations. In her mind, these small infractions justified her cruelty. Irma's psychological detachment was equally disturbing. Survivors describe her as someone who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the suffering of others, a woman who delighted in the power she wielded. She walked through the camp with a kind of satisfaction, a woman who had found her place in the machinery of oppression. Her pride in her appearance, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, was a strange juxtaposition against the brutality of her actions. For Irma, her uniform and appearance were not just symbols of her authority. They were extensions of her identity, markers of the power she held over life and death. One prisoner recounted a particularly horrifying memory of Irma riding past a group of prisoners on her bicycle. A Hungarian woman was standing outside one of the barracks, too exhausted to move quickly enough. Without hesitation, Irma drew her pistol and shot the woman dead, riding away as if nothing had happened. To her, such acts were routine, a display of her control over the camp. This incident was just one of many stories that survivors shared, each one underscoring the complete lack of empathy or remorse in her actions. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Irma's behavior was her twisted ability to manipulate prisoners, setting traps to exploit their desperation. One woman recalled that Irma had spread a rumor that potato peels were being thrown out behind the kitchens. Driven by hunger, the woman and her sister crept out to find the food, only to be ambushed by Irma. She slammed their heads together with such force that the woman felt dizzy and sick for days afterward. Irma's cruelty, as survivors attest, was not limited to punishment. It was a calculated form of psychological torture, designed to break the spirit of those who dared hope or strive for survival. Irma's actions, as monstrous as they were also disturbingly normalized within the culture of the SS. Auschwitz was a place where cruelty was not just allowed, but encouraged, and Irma Grese had become one of its most willing participants. Her swift promotion to senior matron was not a reward for duty alone. It was an acknowledgement of her ability to embrace and enforce the Nazi ideal of toughness. The methods she employed, the terror she inspired, and the pride she took in her role marked her as a model guard, an enforcer of Nazi doctrine without question or mercy. In the bleak, dehumanizing world of Auschwitz, Irma Grese stood out as a figure of almost unimaginable cruelty. Her acts of violence, her sadistic games, and her psychological torment of prisoners all combined to create an atmosphere of constant fear. Her legacy at Auschwitz would haunt survivors long after liberation, a reminder of the horror inflicted by those who wielded their power with joyless cruelty. In time, her reputation spread beyond Auschwitz, her name becoming synonymous with the unspeakable atrocities of the Holocaust. Irma Grese had found her place in the Nazi regime, a role that not only tolerated but rewarded her capacity for inhumanity. She was no longer just a girl from Recken. She was the hyena of Auschwitz, a figure who embodied the darkest possibilities of human nature under the shadow of totalitarian power. As the tides of war began to shift and the Allied forces closed in, Irma's story would take another turn, leading her to Bergen-Belsen and ultimately to the day of reckoning that awaited her. As the war raged on and Allied forces drew ever closer to German-occupied territory, the Nazi regime initiated frantic evacuations of concentration camps in Eastern Europe. Auschwitz, with its horrifying machinery of death, began to empty as SS personnel, and surviving prisoners were transferred to camps further west. In early 1945, Irma Grese requested a transfer to Bergen-Belsen, another Nazi concentration camp located in northern Germany. Bergen-Belsen was no Auschwitz. Its purpose was less about systematic extermination and more about containment. But it was a place of unimaginable suffering, marked by overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Irma's reasons for transferring are not entirely clear, though some accounts suggest that she may have been following Franz Hatzinger, a married SS officer with whom she had formed a relationship at Auschwitz. Her motivation might also have stemmed from a belief that Bergen-Belsen, farther from the front lines, would be safer as the Allies advanced. Regardless of her reasoning, Irma's arrival at Bergen-Belsen marked a new chapter in her brutal career, one that would see her continuing her reign of terror, even as the Nazi regime began to collapse around her. At Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were dire. Originally designed to hold around 10,000 prisoners, by early 1945, the camp housed nearly 60,000, most of whom were emaciated, diseased, and living in squalor. Bergen-Belsen lacked gas chambers, but death was a constant reality. Starvation and typhus swept through the camp, claiming hundreds of lives each day. The infrastructure was overwhelmed, with no adequate facilities to manage the influx of prisoners from other camps, and food supplies were stretched beyond capacity. For the prisoners, Bergen-Belsen was a place of despair, a slow and torturous march toward death. Despite the worsening conditions, Irma's behavior remained as brutal and sadistic as ever. She continued to wield her authority with the same cold detachment, her whip and pistol her ever-present symbols of control. Witnesses recall that her demeanor was as unyielding as it had been at Auschwitz. She demanded order, cleanliness, and discipline, enforcing rules that were impossible for the starving, diseased prisoners to follow. She seemed unaffected by the scenes of despair around her, walking among the prisoners as if the suffering was background noise, as if the skeletal figures around her were less than human. Prisoners recall that Irma's cruelty took on an almost surreal quality at Bergen-Belsen. There, where death was inescapable, she continued to impose punishments with a detached efficiency, treating any minor infraction as a direct affront to her authority. Her dog, a symbol of her power, remained her tool for intimidation, often unleashed on prisoners who failed to comply with her impossible demands. She would walk the rows of prisoners with the same rigid authority, her eyes scanning for any sign of defiance, any excuse to exercise her power over the broken bodies around her. By early 1945, the morale among the SS guards had begun to waver. News of the Allied advance spread, and many guards faced an internal reckoning. Some attempted to flee their posts, while others quietly resigned themselves to their fate, hoping that leniency might be possible if they showed mercy to prisoners in the final days. But Irma remained unwavering. She was still young, still fiercely committed to the ideals of the SS, and in her mind, the Nazi cause was not yet lost. Her allegiance to the Reich, to the power it afforded her, was resolute, even as it became clear that Germany's defeat was inevitable. She continued to carry out her duties, seemingly undeterred by the rumblings of collapse that grew louder with each passing day. On April 15, 1945, the British Second Army arrived at Bergen-Belsen, bringing an end to the horrors that had defined the camp. The British soldiers who entered the camp were unprepared for the devastation they would find there. What they encountered was a scene of unimaginable suffering. Bodies were piled high, the stench of death permeated the air, and thousands of prisoners, emaciated and barely clinging to life, wandered the camp in a state of shock and desperation. The soldiers were horrified, many of them reduced to tears or anger at the sight of such overwhelming suffering. Irma Grese was among the SS guards who remained at Bergen-Belsen when the British arrived. Unlike some of her colleagues, she had not attempted to flee, nor did she express any remorse or fear upon the arrival of the Allied forces. When the British soldiers began rounding up the SS personnel, Irma maintained a chilling composure, standing with her fellow guards and refusing to acknowledge the atrocities that surrounded her. Her defiant attitude, her lack of emotion stunned the British soldiers, who expected at least a semblance of remorse from the people responsible for such horror. Even after her arrest, Irma showed no sign of contrition. When ordered to assist in the burial of the countless bodies strewn across the campgrounds, Irma complied without complaint or hesitation, her demeanor as impassive as it had been during her years as a guard. She handled the bodies with the same indifference she had shown in life, as if the act of burying the dead prisoners was simply another part of her duties. For the British soldiers, this display was disturbing. Here was a young woman who had overseen the suffering and death of thousands, yet who showed no outward emotion, no reaction to the horrors she had helped create. The British were meticulous in documenting the conditions of the camp, capturing photographs and film footage to provide evidence of the atrocities. These images, which would later be shown in courts and to the public, conveyed the scale of the horror at Bergen-Belsen. They documented the skeletal figures of the survivors, the mountains of bodies left unburied, and the harrowing conditions in which prisoners had lived and died. Irma Grese, with her striking appearance and chilling indifference, became one of the faces associated with these atrocities, her image forever linked to the suffering at Bergen-Belsen. In the days following the liberation, as the British soldiers began to understand the full extent of the suffering at the camp, the shock and revulsion they felt toward Irma and her fellow guards grew. For many of the soldiers, the presence of Irma, a young woman who had chosen to remain loyal to the Nazi regime even to the bitter end, was incomprehensible. How could someone so young, so seemingly ordinary, become capable of such profound cruelty? This question, one that would be asked repeatedly in the years to come, lay at the heart of Irma's eventual trial and the fascination that her case would inspire. In the end, Irma's capture at Bergen-Belsen marked the beginning of her reckoning. The woman who had once patrolled the camp with pride, the hyena of Auschwitz, was now a prisoner herself, subject to the scrutiny and judgment of the world she had once terrorized. She had remained defiant to the last, a figure whose loyalty to the Reich had led her down a path of unimaginable darkness. Her fate, along with that of her fellow SS guards, would soon be decided in a courtroom, where the horror of Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz would be recounted in agonizing detail. Irma Grese's journey was nearing its end. The young woman who had risen through the ranks of the SS, who had embraced power and cruelty with a fervor few could understand, was now at the mercy of the Allied forces. As she awaited trial, her story would soon be laid bare for the world to see, her legacy forever tied to the atrocities of the Holocaust. When Irma Grese was brought before the British military tribunal in September 1945, the world's gaze was firmly fixed on her and her fellow SS guards. Officially known as the Belsen Trials, this military tribunal was one of the first to hold Nazi war criminals accountable for the unspeakable crimes they had committed in the concentration camps. For the British officers presiding over the trial, Irma represented something that was both compelling and horrifying. She was young, female, and undeniably beautiful, yet she stood accused of atrocities that defied human comprehension. The media quickly took notice, branding her the beautiful beast, and turning her into a symbol of the inhumanity of the Holocaust. The courtroom was a stark, tension-filled place where survivors and witnesses faced their former tormentors, recounting memories that still haunted them. When Irma entered the courtroom, flanked by guards, her expression was one of indifference. She held her head high, showing no remorse, no trace of guilt. In the days and weeks that followed, her behavior would shock those in attendance, as she often appeared bored or even amused during the testimony of the survivors. At times she would smirk, turn her head away dismissively, or stifle a laugh. Her detachment, her complete lack of contrition, stunned everyone present. For the survivors who had suffered under her hand, this trial was both a chance to seek justice and a painful confrontation with the person who had inflicted such terror. One by one, they took the stand, recounting the horrors they had endured at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. They described Irma's whip, her pistol, and her German shepherd, each item a symbol of the brutality she wielded with terrifying ease. Many of them struggled to speak, their voices breaking as they recalled the roll calls, the beatings, and the selections where she had pointed them, or their loved ones, to their deaths. A witness who had survived Auschwitz spoke with a trembling voice, recounting a moment that had scarred her memory. She described Irma's participation in the selection process, watching as Irma walked the lines, pointing prisoners toward the gas chambers with the flick of her hand, her expression void of empathy. "She looked at us like we were nothing," the witness said. "She smiled while she sent us to die." Another survivor, a mother who had lost her children, recounted Irma's potato peel trap, a trick that had resulted in severe punishment for anyone desperate enough to fall for it. As the survivor described her beating, her voice grew faint, but her words left a powerful impression on the court. The prosecutors presented extensive evidence of Irma's role in enforcing the Nazi regime's brutality, laying out testimony after testimony, each account a grim reminder of her sadistic behavior. They argued that Irma had gone far beyond the duties of a guard. She had embraced her role with a zeal that marked her as one of the most ruthless figures in the camp system. Her loyalty to the SS and to Nazi ideology, they argued, was so profound that she saw cruelty as an act of devotion, a means of proving her commitment to the Reich. Her swift promotions, her reputation for toughness, and her willingness to carry out any order without question painted a chilling picture of someone who had fully internalized the Nazi doctrine of racial hatred and dehumanization. Irma's own defense was minimal. Her attorney, Major L.S.W. Cranfield, had little to work with, as Irma refused to cooperate or show any remorse. Her only defense was a common one among Nazi officials, that she had been following orders. She insisted that her actions were simply the duties expected of her in her position as a guard, and that she bore no personal responsibility for the suffering she had caused. To her, loyalty to the Reich and obedience to her superiors justified everything she had done. In her mind, she was merely a soldier carrying out the tasks assigned to her by the regime. But Irma's own attitude betrayed her. Her disregard for the testimonies, her mocking expressions, and her complete lack of remorse were evident to everyone present. She seemed utterly convinced of her own righteousness, as if her actions were beyond reproach. When the court showed footage of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, scenes of emaciated prisoners, piles of bodies, and the unendurable conditions the prisoners had faced, Irma barely reacted. She would glance at the screen, perhaps to feign attention, but she quickly turned away, often to fix her hair or adjust her posture, as if she were completely removed from the horrors she had helped create. As the days of the trial passed, the weight of the evidence and the survivors' testimonies mounted, painting a picture of Irma Grese that left no doubt of her guilt. The prosecutors and judges alike were struck by the consistency of the accounts against her. Too many survivors, too many witnesses had described the same cruelty, the same sadistic acts. Irma's defense of just following orders was insufficient against the mountain of evidence, against the tears and trembling voices of those she had terrorized. Her fate was inevitable. When the time came for sentencing, the court was filled with a tense silence. On November 17, 1945, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Irma Grese was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. Alongside Juana Bormann and Elisabeth Volkenrath, she was one of only 3 women out of the 19 SS matrons on trial to receive the death sentence. Irma's expression remained impassive, as though the sentence was nothing more than an inconvenience. In the weeks leading up to her execution, Irma's unrepentant attitude persisted. Confined to a cell at Hamelin prison, she wrote letters to her family, bidding them farewell and expressing a strange form of pride in her service to the Reich. She sent her love to her siblings and urged them to remember her as they had last seen her. "Even in the worst of trouble, I am loyal to my fatherland to the death," she wrote, maintaining her belief in the Nazi ideology even as she faced her own mortality. During her final nights, Irma, Juana Bormann, and Elisabeth Volkenrath stayed awake, defiantly singing Nazi songs from their cells. The British guards stationed outside the cells were both disturbed and fascinated. Here were women condemned for the most heinous of crimes, yet they showed no remorse, no regret. The singing echoed through the prison walls, a final act of defiance, as if they clung to the Nazi cause even as they awaited their punishment. On the morning of December 13, 1945, the executions were scheduled to take place. The British executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, had been tasked with carrying out the sentences, and he approached the day's duties with the same solemnity and efficiency he brought to every execution. Irma Grese was the second of the condemned to be brought to the scaffold. As she was led into the prison courtyard, she showed no fear. Her face set in a calm expression that was almost unsettling. She climbed the steps briskly, positioning herself on the trapdoor with precision. Pierrepoint, whose duty was to carry out the execution with dignity, placed the hood over her head and adjusted the noose around her neck. In a final moment of defiance, Irma whispered, "Schnell." Quickly, her last word, a chilling reminder of her unwavering loyalty to the Nazi regime and her unrepentant nature. The trapdoor opened, and with a muted crack, Irma's life came to an end. At 22 years old, Irma Grese was one of the youngest women ever to be formally executed by British authorities. Her execution, part of a larger reckoning for the crimes of the Holocaust, became emblematic of the horrific cruelty that ordinary individuals could commit under the influence of ideology and unchecked power. The woman who had terrorized thousands in the concentration camps, who had worn her uniform with pride and wielded her authority with joyless cruelty, was now gone, her life extinguished on the very scaffold where justice had finally caught up to her. For the survivors and those who had witnessed her trial, Irma Grese's execution marked the end of one chapter. Though the memories of her cruelty would linger for a lifetime, she had left behind a legacy of pain and terror, her name forever bound to the horrors of the Holocaust. The world moved forward, but the memory of the beautiful beast would remain, a haunting reminder of what humanity could become when hatred, loyalty, and power replaced empathy and conscience. The execution of Irma Grese did not end her story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a legacy that would haunt history. Her role in the Holocaust, her youth, and the disturbing contradictions she embodied, a young, seemingly ordinary woman who committed unspeakable acts, ensured that her name would be remembered. Her case became a focal point for historians, psychologists, and the public, each seeking to understand how a person could transform so completely into a symbol of cruelty. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Irma Grese's image circulated widely in the media. Her youth and appearance became points of fascination, especially among Western audiences. The press, captivated by the unsettling contrast between her physical beauty and her vicious behavior, branded her the beautiful beast. This title underscored a strange, almost perverse fascination with her, as if her actions were somehow more horrific because they were committed by a young woman who defied conventional expectations. The focus on her appearance added an unsettling layer to her story, often obscuring the deeper issues at play, issues of ideology, environment, and the capacity for cruelty in all people, regardless of gender. This fixation on her looks was not limited to public fascination. Even in academic circles, Irma's case raised important questions about female perpetrators of violence. Throughout history, society has often stereotyped women as less capable of extreme aggression, imagining them as nurturers and caretakers rather than agents of brutality. But Irma, alongside other female Nazi guards like Maria Mandel and Juana Bormann, shattered these stereotypes. Her actions challenged the perception of femininity itself, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable reality that cruelty knows no gender, and that ideologies like Nazism could turn anyone, male or female, into an instrument of terror. Irma Grese's story also exposed how the machinery of the Nazi regime recruited and molded young individuals, particularly those from rural, economically struggling backgrounds. Scholars have noted that the concentration camp system drew heavily from working-class, minimally educated young people, often from provincial towns and villages that had been deeply affected by Germany's economic hardships. For these recruits, the Nazi Party offered not only a livelihood but a sense of importance, belonging, and purpose. Irma, a girl from a fractured family with failed ambitions, fit this profile almost perfectly. Historians studying the psychology of the Holocaust have often pointed to Irma as an example of what Hannah Arendt famously termed the banality of evil. The idea that ordinary people can commit monstrous acts when they become part of a system that normalizes and even rewards cruelty. Irma Grese was not born a monster. She was shaped, conditioned, and ultimately consumed by a system that valued her willingness to obey without question. In her case, the conditioning was so complete that she adopted the ideology with enthusiasm, internalizing the values of the SS and embracing her role within the camps. This transformation from an isolated girl to an agent of terror has become a critical study for those seeking to understand how authoritarian systems create perpetrators out of ordinary citizens. Yet Irma's legacy extends beyond the history books and academic studies. For Holocaust survivors, Irma Grese is not merely a figure of historical analysis, but a haunting memory. For those who encountered her, she was a symbol of the terror that governed their daily lives, a reminder of the fear and suffering inflicted by the people who saw them as subhuman. To the survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, Irma represented something far more personal and painful than the banality of evil. She was a specific face, a name, a person who had inflicted real pain on real people, whose actions had left scars, both physical and psychological, that could never fully heal. In later years, scholars and psychologists have debated the degree to which Irma Grese's actions were shaped by her own inherent sadism versus her indoctrination by the Nazi regime. Some argue that Irma's cruelty went beyond the standard brutality of an SS guard, suggesting that her sadism was an intrinsic part of her personality. Others believe that she, like many guards, was a product of the rigorous training and ideological conditioning that stripped away empathy and encouraged violence. Whatever the case, Irma's actions at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen were extreme, even by the standards of the Nazi camps, and this has left a lingering question. To what extent was Irma a victim of indoctrination, and to what extent was she a willing perpetrator? As the years passed, Irma's story continued to be studied, retold, and analyzed, each retelling bringing new insights and new debates. Her image has surfaced in books, documentaries, and films, each portrayal an attempt to grapple with the horror she represented. She has become, in many ways, a symbol of the darkest possibilities within humanity, a reminder of what can happen when systems of hate take hold and corrupt the minds of individuals. The lessons of Irma Grese's life are deeply relevant today, as scholars, activists, and historians stress the importance of recognizing how environments can shape behavior, how prejudice and indoctrination can transform individuals, and how power can corrupt even the most unassuming people. Her story is a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the potential for darkness within every society and the need to guard against systems that strip away our humanity. In reflecting on her life, one must return to the question posed at the beginning. How does a rural girl from a modest background become a figure of such profound cruelty? The answer is complex, and it lies not only in her personal history, but in the broader context of Nazi Germany, a regime that capitalized on fear, hatred, and the desire for power. Irma Grese's life serves as a reminder of the dangers of ideological indoctrination and the importance of maintaining a sense of empathy, even in the most challenging times. Today, the legacy of Irma Grese endures as both a historical caution and a psychological study. She was a person who embraced her role in one of history's darkest chapters, a figure whose life challenges our assumptions about innocence, gender, and the nature of evil. Remembering her is not an act of fascination, but a necessary acknowledgement of the past, a recognition of the atrocities she committed, and a reminder of why vigilance against such hatred is essential. Her life, though horrifying, provides lessons on the importance of empathy, the resilience of the human spirit, and the dangers of allowing prejudice to override compassion. As history remembers Irma Grese, it does so not to glorify her, but to understand the conditions that led to her transformation. Her legacy is not a celebration, but a stark warning of the consequences when humanity is lost to ideology and power. The Beautiful Beast, a title as disturbing as the story it represents, will remain a haunting reminder of the need to resist hatred in all its forms, to ensure that history's darkest moments are never repeated. Thank you for joining us on this exploration into the life and legacy of Irma Grese here on Bio Bytes. Our journey through history serves as a reminder of the importance of empathy, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to remember the past so that we may learn from it. Irma's story, as dark as it is, offers critical insights into the dangers of hatred, the power of indoctrination, and the responsibility we all share to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. If you found today's story thought-provoking, please like, subscribe, and join us for more as we continue to explore the lives that shaped, and sometimes scarred, our world. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, history's lessons are meant to guide us toward a more compassionate future.